Death camps. Hitler created a network of 1,000 death camps throughout Europe used to exterminate the Jews and other minorities. There were a few survivors of those camps, and we have with us this morning a prominent international lawyer, author, scholar, and a man who survived the death camps, Dr. Samuel Pisar. Good morning, Dr. Pisar.
Good morning, Eileen.
You were a 13-year-old young boy in Białystok, Poland. Your family was forced to the ghetto. Those Jews that were not killed were terrorized or beaten, forced to wear armbands with the Star of David that were humiliating. What was that like for you? Talk about your experience then.
Well, for me, the war began in 1939, the Soviet occupation first. Then in 1941, cold, some of those Polish winters without wood to burn, without any form of heat. We talk today about an energy crisis. I can testify as someone who has had to live without heat, without coverings, without gas, without electricity.
And
you adjust to many of these things, but it was really the collapse of a world.
And yet, as horrible as that sounds in your description, that was only a prelude to the death camps. Before the deportation, you lost your father. He was killed trying to get kids out of the ghetto, wasn't he?
Well, my father was killed in 1942. He was trying to smuggle children out of the ghetto. Some of the Jewish families felt, painful as it was, that if they could send their children away to some Christian peasant family, they would give them a chance to live. It was very dramatic. And of course it was much easier to give away a little girl than a little boy for obvious reasons. And my father was involved in an organized attempt to smuggle out as many of the young children of 3, 4, 5, to the peasants. And on one occasion he was caught, tortured, and executed.
What happened to your mother, Helena, and your sister, Frieda?
Well, we were in the ghetto for a while by ourselves. And of course the population of the ghetto was being decimated, not only through hunger and cold and misery, but because systematically the Nazis would arrive and take away people. We wouldn't know where these people were being taken, but the population dwindled until it reached a point when it was our turn, when everything was being liquidated and where we were being deported to unknown destinations.
Your mother and Frieda, you all arrived at the camp together, didn't you?
No.
What happened?
When the ghetto was being liquidated, the people were separated basically into two different columns. The men, the workers, who could be useful to the Germans, they were sent off to one side, and the women, the children, the old and the sick in the other direction. And we didn't know it for sure at the time, but of course they were sent directly to the gas chambers. And my mother had this extraordinary motherly intuition. She decided, without consulting me, to try to make me pass for a man. She told me to get dressed in long pants. It was the middle of summer, instead of short pants, hoping that I would look older and that the Nazis would see in me a young man who could be useful for a while longer and who could be sent to a labor camp. And I think at that moment she saved my life. In fact, I think at that moment she gave me life for the second time, probably more painfully than the first. And that happened, as I see it now, precisely at the moment when she went off to die. And that was the moment of separation forever. After that, I was on my own and I had to take destiny into my own hands.
As a 13-year-old, did you know what was happening to your life?
Yes, not in the beginning, but gradually it was obvious that a monstrous machine was intent on destroying us. And it became a kind of a relentless process of human destruction.
Talk about a typical day in the camp, if you would. You learned to use your ingenuity and your resources very quickly, didn't you?
Well, Eileen, in conditions of this kind, conditions in which human beings had not been before, you either collapse immediately or you learn to pump the adrenaline of survival. In my case, after the initial shock, I became determined that I had to do something in order to survive. And not only for my own sake, but for the sake of all of these innocent people who were being sent off to their death. It became a kind of an obsession with me.
And as your mother dressed you in long pants, so did you become determined to be a man. You presented yourself as a man with a trade.
Well, I tried to make myself look older. Whenever asked my age, I would say I'm 18. Of course, I was lying, but I was fairly big for my age, and it helped me. And as to describing a typical day in the camp, I think that would be a little too hard for you to listen to, but I can give you a few small vignettes if you like.
Do.
It didn't take me long to become a seasoned prisoner. You mature very quickly in such conditions. You learn to drag out of your mind, out of your body, out of your psyche, the maximum, because you have to measure yourself at every instant with hunger, with sadism, with degradation, and with death itself. So what happens is that you develop muscles very quickly, and I don't mean physical muscles. I mean muscles of the nervous system. You become basically an animal. You react with your instinct, with your reflexes, and you learn to feel danger and how to react to it. And of course you always know that you have only one chance. I remember thinking to myself at Auschwitz when I arrived, and when I really understood what I was up against, that this is not like being in school when the teacher asked you a question or asked you to write something and you could do a draft and then you had a second chance. There was no second chance. You had to decide on the spot quickly or else.
Elie Wiesel is another survivor of a camp, and he wrote a book called Night, and I read it last week, and in it he said, for the children, for many of the children, the consequence of the horror was the death of God in their souls. They had suddenly discovered absolute evil. What happened to your faith in God?
Well, the death of God I don't know, but I will tell you this. At the moment I was separated from my mother, it's kind of a unique scene in a child's life, knowing that I would never see her again, knowing that I would never see my 8-year-old sister again. In my ignorance and in my innocence, there was a kind of a rage within me. And at that moment, I really think I raised my fist to heaven and threatened the Almighty. I did not pray to him at that moment. I was just so outraged that, and I ask you to forgive me if it sounds blasphemous, but I was a child at that point. I really think at that moment I put myself at his level, or else I felt that he had sunk to my level, because that kind of an outrage had never happened before, and that was probably the most dramatic point in my relationship with him, but I have never denied him.
Knowing that you were a part of the extermination plan, there was death all around you, how do you survive the despair or the hate? I mean, it could eat you up. How did you survive that?
The despair was more difficult to survive than the hate, because the hate was attenuated by hunger and by danger. You know, when you're hungry, and hunger is not going on a diet or measuring out your food intake in calories. Hunger is a kind of a gnawing, hallucinating process that destroys not only your body but your mind. And you feel drugged most of the time, anesthetized. And that enables you to dominate your hate and to subdue almost everything in an effort to find something to eat, no matter what, no matter where, no matter when. Of course, the hatred was much stronger later, after the liberation.
Would you share with our viewers, when you escaped selection, the time that you escaped several times, but the time with scrubbing the floor?
Well, this was in Auschwitz. And of course, by then, it was about a year after I had arrived in the camps. I knew my way about. And from time to time, they would put us through a process of selection. You would file past, and Dr. Mengele, the infamous angel of death, would stand there, smoke a cigarette, and look at the prisoners, and he would send one to the right and one to the left, quite capriciously, as fancy took him. And I was lucky a few times, but on one occasion, maybe because I had become skeletal, I ended up in the wrong column. And we were herded in, about 500 of us, into a barrack, waiting our turn to be processed in the gas chamber. You are shocked that I can speak about it with such equanimity, but I am relating to you a page out of my own life. Most people were despondent, had given up, maybe because I was so young, but I was determined not to give up. So I saw at the end of the barrack a brush and a pail of water, and I crawled up to it. I took it and I started furiously to scrub the floor, all the time coming closer to the exit. And I scrubbed as if I was going through some kind of a death rattle, saying to myself, you must do something, this cannot be the end, not after all of this time and everything you'd already gone through. All the time coming closer to the exit. And at the exit were two Nazi guards with submachine guns. And as I came closer, scrubbing, they unwittingly became participants in the process. I remember one of them kicked me and said, look, you slob, there is still a dirty patch, scrub it again. And I did, all the time coming closer. And when I came to the exit, there were two steps. I spent a particularly long time scrubbing those literally with my nails. And when I was finished, I slowly stood up, turned around, picked up the bucket, put the brush on my back, and with very measured step started to walk off towards the camp. Of course, I waited for a shout, for a blow on the head. Where do you think you're going? Nothing. Somehow they had forgotten. I think that I tricked them. They somehow, you know, after all, they were some form of humanity. They must have been thinking about how soon at 5 o'clock they'll go home to their family, to their girlfriend, and they assumed that I was there to do a job. Something clicked in their mind and they didn't react. And in a few moments I had merged with the others in the camp, and I was again among the living, or among those who were meant to live a little longer. And I remember, Eileen, as I'm sitting here with you, on the bunk that night, thinking whether my mother would have recognized me. You know, that little boy, she was always worried, who would walk out in the street without a scarf around his neck, who wouldn't take the vitamin in his milk, who was riding around on the bicycle and might have a traffic accident, all those normal risks of life. If she had really believed that her boy could have become so resourceful, so cunning, in this furious struggle to survive. This is how we learn.
You know, last week I was reading your book of Blood and Hope in Phoenix. I was on vacation, and I was telling someone sitting next to me what we were doing on the show. And this woman said, hasn't there been enough done on the Holocaust? And my comment was, there's a whole generation that does not know. There's a whole new generation that needs to know this happened.
This is why I wrote the book. I did not want to write a book about the Holocaust. The story has been told, and it should be told more, but that was not my problem. My problem was to convey to a new generation, particularly the young,
yes, and the young
Jews and non-Jews, of what it was like, how my world had once collapsed, and how worlds collapse, how new dangers of all kinds are accumulating.
There is much to be said. There is an audience watching us, I only hope, today, of young people who are away from school.
And I wanted to convey it to them not with the horrors, but to convey it to them in a human way. What happens to a child, to a boy who leads a normal life and who suddenly is faced with these inhuman, extraordinary circumstances and conditions, and what you do to survive.
Dr. Pisar, you were a survivor with a long healing process, I'm sure, one of moral and physical dimensions. How did you go through that? I mean, after the fact.
Well, my moment of liberation was very dramatic. It was the vision of a Sherman tank with a glorious white star. I was liberated by the US Army in the spring of 1945 after I escaped. I don't know for sure whether I was a few days before or after my 16th birthday. Now, because I was so young, I think for me the healing process was probably easier. As I told you earlier, I had learned to pump the adrenaline of survival. But I realized very quickly that physical survival in Auschwitz was in many ways easier than the moral survival that lay ahead, because there I was, a 16-year-old kid in the ashes and ruins of Europe, without a family, without a school. I hadn't been to school for 4 years, without any supervision, and I fell apart. I was determined to be free and to live freedom to the hilt. And freedom without rules, without supervision, without authority can be every bit as destructive as physical danger. So then began a tremendous struggle for moral survival.
Are you still going through that struggle in any way? Is that a lifelong struggle?
I am afraid that when you have to survive for long periods of time, there is something permanent that senses danger and that makes you realize, and it's a very healthy realization, that life is nothing but a perpetual struggle for survival. I did not discuss it at home for a very long time. My children are relatively young, and I felt that I should do whatever I can to spare them the horrors. Of course, often it was unavoidable. My daughter Leah would see a number on my arm, and she would naturally want to know what it is. The way I made peace with my children on this entire subject, children who always wanted to know but were afraid to ask, and I would avoid telling them, was that in writing this book, I would slip them a chapter. They would read it, and I would ask them to correct, to criticize, and in the course of that conversation, the whole story unfolded for them in great detail, and that got it out of our systems once and for all, and today it's a perfectly natural part of our family life. It's not something that hangs over us and depresses us all the time. The attitude is more positive, the issue being, how do we avoid these sort of things from happening again?
You wrote in Blood and Hope, while in the camp, it occurred to you, doesn't anyone in the world think that Jews have a right to live? In passing the story on to your children, do you ever feel that you perpetrate the idea of being a persecuted race? Do you know what I mean?
Well, we try to convey to our children the sense of danger and tragedy that has been pervasive throughout Jewish history, and the danger that still exists today all over the world and in Israel. We are a people that has been through many Holocausts, large ones and smaller ones, and of course never larger than the Nazi Holocaust. So that we have, I think, a duty and an inclination, particularly the survivors, to make our children conscious of that. And of course we have a double duty, because our children, for the most part, don't have grandfathers, they don't have uncles, they don't have aunts. So that the chain throughout history must not be broken. And this is what we are very conscious of. This can be said. What happened there was that Europe gradually collapsed. Collapsed through all kinds of mundane things. There was unemployment, there was inflation, there was disorder, there were politicians that couldn't cope with the situation. And this is what created an atmosphere for demagogic political leaders, for tyrants who thought they had all the answers. And of course they needed to explain why things didn't work, so they needed scapegoats. And the Jews have always been the favorite scapegoats of history. So the Jews became the first victims. Then came the others, trade unionists, immigrants, religious minorities, dissidents, until all of Germany became one vast concentration camp, except for the master race. Now, it's very painful today to watch in the world, and even in the United States, anti-Semitic attacks, swastikas smeared on walls occasionally, synagogues desecrated, religious schools. This does happen, and this, of course, is terribly painful for a survivor. I don't think what happened in Nazi Germany could ever happen in the United States. The American people are just not made that way. We're a country of big minorities, and it's difficult enough to get us to agree on any issue, let alone on something that would amount to the methodical persecution of a minority. This can never happen again. But there are danger signs, danger signals, and I think we must make it clear, particularly to the younger people, that an aggression against the Jews, anti-Semitism, or against any minority, is an aggression against society itself, against all of us, because this is how such a process begins, and this is how it spreads, until an entire world, an entire society, becomes sick and becomes destroyed. This is how Europe collapsed. Other people were indifferent. They felt that it didn't affect them, that Hitler was after the Jews and that he would stop. But then they realized that this did not stop, that he was going on and on and on until everyone was engulfed by the fire. And that is an important lesson that I have carried from that experience.
Let's see.
Anything can happen, and things will happen again in the future. I don't think that there will be another Holocaust against the Jews in the same way in which it had happened before. I don't think we will allow it. I don't think the American people will allow it. I think that the Jewish people are determined that this will never happen again. But of course, societies do become sick. Economic problems are upon us. Things can fall apart. And this is why we must be alert to make certain that whatever the form, that such aggressions, such cruelty, such prejudice, such hatred is wiped out forever.
No, if he had any happiness or any friends or anything.
Oh, you mean Dr. Pisar? He had two friends, Nico and Ben.
Nico and Ben. Nico and Ben were two friends out of Homer, out of the Iliad. Because we were living extraordinary times, almost biblical times. And in answer to this question, I can truly say that without my two friends, I would not have survived. And I don't think they would have either.
But for the young man, he should know, these were friends you met at the camp. Well, you'd known Ben before.
Well, Ben was really at school with me in the city of Białystok in eastern Poland. And we used to play football together when we were kids of 10 and 11. And we found one another in camp by coincidence. And of course, that created such a relationship. I mean, we were closer than brothers. And Nico's cattle train arrived at Auschwitz from Holland. He was a Dutchman, a little older than we were. And the three of us became so closely knit. We were an army of three. And together we were much stronger in terms of survivability than three individuals. Each one of us
I'm glad to hear from a young man.
would not have made it alone.
I'm glad that that young man called us together.
The signs, for example, are that not long ago, a very powerful bomb was placed at the doorstep of a synagogue in Paris.
We had destruction right here in Boston.
Many people. There was a bomb that was exploded recently in the Jewish quarter of Antwerp in Belgium. Another bomb was planted in Vienna, and one even in Berlin. And of course you have all of these terrorist attacks all the time. And
the Nazis marching in Skokie.
The Nazis marching in Skokie, and anti-Semitic slogans drawn on the walls of synagogues and of schools. And these are signs of hatred. These are signs of madness. If these things were not nipped in the bud, stopped, they could spread and become a conflagration. Methodically dispatched to the other world. The Jews did no one any harm. These were innocent people. These were people who lived a peaceful world, a world that no longer exists except in the books of Isaac Bashevis Singer. And nothing would have helped us, even if we had changed our religion, even if we had assimilated, even if we had sworn loyalty to the Nazis. We had to be destroyed in the Nazi ideology for the reason that our blood was tainted. If the Lord Jesus Christ had been at Auschwitz with me, I often felt he would have been destroyed along with me because his blood was also tainted.
Well,
we were Jewish and we were not entitled to live.
In closing, I'd like to just read a passage from Samuel Pisar's book of Blood and Hope. The lessons I have culled from the crucible of real life, whatever I know about the undoing of nations and the triumph of man, teach me that as long as hope pulsates within us, like blood, redemption is possible. Like survival itself, for a society, for a people, for an individual, even for a child, even without parents, without means, without education, without health, even in conditions that stagger the mind. And as Jews all over the world say very often, never again.